Tonight, we revisit one case that became part of the British historical record, and then, in the manner characteristic of many such records, diminished to a marginal notation. One young woman, one investigation, one conviction that closed the file without restoring what had been lost. The case of Matilda Clover begins in Lambeth, London, in October of 1891. Lambeth at that time was one of the densely populated working-class districts of South London, situated on the south bank of the Thames, directly across the river from the more prosperous districts of Westminster and Chelsea. The borough contained a mixed population of labourers, domestic servants, tradespeople, and those who lived at the lower margins of the Victorian economy, concentrated in streets of multi-occupancy, lodging houses, and terraced dwellings that extended in dense rows from the river southward toward Kennington and beyond. The Lambeth Road itself was a long unremarkable thoroughfare running eastward from Lambeth Bridge towards St George's Circus, lined with public houses, small shops, and the kind of lodging establishments that housed the transient population of South London. The proximity of Waterloo Railway Terminus, less than a mile to the north, ensured a constant movement of workers, travellers, and those without fixed situations through the streets of the borough. Gas lamps lit the main roads in the evenings. The October nights were cold. The streets remained busy into the late hours. It was within this neighbourhood, in lodgings at or near 27 Lambeth Road, that Matilda Clover was living in the autumn of 1891. She was approximately 27 years old. The official record does not preserve the precise date or place of her birth, the names of her parents, or the circumstances of her early life. The documentary record, as it exists across the coroner's proceedings, the subsequent trial, and the secondary literature compiled in the century that followed, begins effectively with her presence in Lambeth in 1891 and extends no further backward than that. She was English, she was unmarried, she was living in rented lodgings, one room in a house of multiple tenants, in a district of London that housed many thousands of people in similar circumstances. The record is silent on the years before Lambeth. No birth registration has been cited in the standard accounts, no family correspondence, no census reference that the accessible secondary literature has drawn upon to reconstruct a childhood, a home county, a family formation, or a route by which she arrived in South London. She was there in October 1891. The record knows nothing more of her origins than that. Matilda Clover supported herself through prostitution. She solicited in the streets and public houses of Lambeth and received male visitors in her lodgings. This was not unusual in the district. The area around Waterloo and Lambeth Road was known for street prostitution, connected to the transient populations moving through the railway, termini, and the surrounding lodging houses. Women who supported themselves in this way occupied a precise and precarious position in Victorian society. Their activity was tolerated by the police in certain districts and certain circumstances, prosecuted intermittently under vagrancy and public order statutes, and treated by the courts, the press, and the charitable organisations that concern themselves with such matters as evidence of moral failure rather than as evidence of economic circumstance. The institutions of Victorian London, the constabulary, the coroner's courts, the medical profession in its lower reaches, applied to women in Clover's position a consistent diminution of scrutiny. Their lives received less attention. Their deaths received less investigation. If you find value in stories preserved this way, in cases drawn from the court records and inquest testimony of the Victorian period and set before you without embellishment, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now back to the record. The lodging house at or near 27 Lambeth Road was a building of the ordinary kind for the district, a multi-storey terraced structure accommodating several tenants across its floors, managed by a landlady who occupied part of the premises and collected rent from those above and below. The arrangement provided minimum accommodation at minimum cost. A tenant in such a house occupied a single room. shared the staircase and whatever communal facilities the house possessed, and conducted the business of daily life in the relative proximity of other tenants and the landlady below. Sounds carried. Distress in the night would not have gone unheard. The evening of the 20th of October 1891 was an ordinary evening in Lambeth. Matilda Clover received a male visitor at her lodgings that night. The visitor was described by witnesses to the extent that witness accounts were later gathered and recorded as a man of respectable appearance. He called on her during the evening and remained for a period before departing. The description given subsequently, after the investigation that no one on that night could have anticipated, was consistent in several material respects with the man who would later be charged with her murder. After the visitor departed, Matilda Clover became violently ill. The symptoms that followed were not ambiguous to those who witnessed them, though their cause was not understood at the time. She suffered convulsions. The body was seized by the intense muscular spasms that are characteristic of strychnine poisoning. Rigid contraction of the muscles, including the jaw, the back, and the limbs. Repeated episodes of spasm during which the body arched backward in the posture physicians of the period referred to as opistotonos. Sensitivity to light and sound was present. The convulsions recurred at intervals. Strychnine acts rapidly upon ingestion, typically within 15 to 30 minutes, and produces its effects through interference with the inhibitory signals in the spinal cord that ordinarily regulate muscular contraction. The muscles contract without restraint. The victim does not lose consciousness through the early stages of the poisoning. The process is violent and prolonged. The landlady was alerted to Clover's condition. The nature of the sounds from the room was sufficient to rouse the house. A physician was summoned to the address. The attending physician arrived and found Matilda Clover in the condition described. He administered what care was available to him. She died in the course of that night. The attending physician certified the cause of death as delirium tremens. Delirium tremens is the severe neurological syndrome associated with withdrawal from chronic alcohol dependence. In its most acute form, it produces tremor, disorientation, hallucination, and in some cases convulsions that, to a physician examining a patient without prior knowledge and without toxicological testing, might bear a superficial resemblance to the convulsions of strychnine poisoning. The attending physician made the determination that Matilda Clover was a woman whose circumstances and social position were consistent with chronic alcoholism, and that the violent symptoms witnessed before her death were attributable to that cause. The determination required no toxicological analysis. It required a clinical judgment made in a rented room in Lambeth in the early hours of the morning, in the presence of a dead woman whose life had not been considered worth investigating, and whose death was not considered worth investigating either. The certificate was completed. The cause of death was entered as delirium tremens. An inquest was convened in the days following Matilda Clover's death. Coroners' courts in the Lambeth area convened in local venues. Vestry halls, public houses repurposed for official proceedings, or the dedicated rooms maintained for that function in local civic buildings. The inquest was presided over by the local coroner, whose name does not appear with certainty in the standard secondary accounts, and whose identity would require consultation of the original inquest records to establish. A jury of local men was empanelled, as required by the coroner's court process of the period. The jury heard the evidence available to it. The evidence was limited. The attending physician gave testimony as to the circumstances of his attendance and his determination as to the cause of death. The landlady gave an account of what she had witnessed and heard on the night of the 20th. The jury retired and returned a verdict consistent with the medical evidence before it. Matilda Clover had died from the effects of delirium tremens. The verdict was entered in the record. The inquest was closed. She was buried. The standard accounts do not record the name of the cemetery or the nature of the burial arrangements. the record passes the fact of her interment without specifying its location. The death of Matilda Clover was recorded and filed as a natural death from causes associated with her manner of living. No crime had been identified. No investigation was warranted. No detective had been dispatched. No suspicion had been raised and carried forward. The attending physician had done what attending physicians in Lambeth did in such cases. The coroner's jury had returned the verdict it was given evidence to support. The institution had functioned as it was designed to function. Matilda Clover's murder remained undetected. The institutional failure that produced this outcome was not the product of corruption or deliberate concealment. It was the product of routine. The application of reduced scrutiny to deaths in this social stratum was not a policy decided and implemented at any particular moment. It was the accumulated practice of a system that did not regard the deaths of poor women in Lambeth, lodging houses, as requiring the same quality of investigation that it applied to deaths in more prosperous circumstances. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 had placed strychnine on the schedule of poisons, requiring records to be kept in its dispensing. The Sale of Arsenic Act of 1851 had addressed arsenic specifically, following the numerous poisoning cases of the mid-century that had prompted legislative intervention. These provisions existed. They did not prevent the death of Matilda Clover. They did not prompt a toxicological examination of her remains. The regulatory framework was present. The institutional attention that would have made use of it was not. The file closed. The case entered the archive as a natural death. And the man who had given Matilda Clover the pills that killed her walked away from 27 Lambeth Road and continued moving through the streets of Lambeth. The man who visited Matilda Clover on the evening of the 20th of October 1891 was Thomas Neal Cream. He had been in England for only a matter of weeks at the time of her death. He had arrived in London in October 1891 from North America, where he had spent the preceding decade in circumstances that, had they been known to any official in Lambeth, would have marked him immediately as a man of dangerous character. They were not known. He arrived in London presenting himself as a physician of reputable standing, and he was received accordingly. Thomas Neal Cream was born in Glasgow, Scotland on the 27th of May 1850. When he was approximately 4 years of age, his family emigrated to Canada, settling in the province of Quebec. His father, William Cream, worked in the timber trade in the Quebec region, and the family achieved a degree of stability and modest prosperity by the standards of immigrant communities of the period. Cream received an education commensurate with the family's position and demonstrated sufficient aptitude in his studies to pursue a professional qualification. He enrolled at McGill University in Montreal and graduated with the degree of Bachelor of Medicine in 1876. After completing his degree at McGill, he travelled to London to pursue postgraduate training at St Thomas's Hospital, one of the principal teaching hospitals of the period, where he studied during 1876 and 1877. He subsequently sought further qualification in Edinburgh. The precise credential he obtained from his Edinburgh studies is a matter requiring verification against the records of the relevant examining body, but the pattern of his training was consistent with that of a young physician of the period seeking to establish respectable professional credentials across multiple institutions. The credential, in Cream's case, was put to uses its institutions had not intended. Before Cream arrived in London, before he presented himself to the lodging houses and public houses of Lambeth as a physician of conventional respectability, the record of his life had already accumulated a pattern that would have been recognised for what it was, had the relevant authorities communicated with one another across the Atlantic. The first suspicious death associated with Thomas Neal Cream occurred in Ontario, Canada, during the period immediately following his graduation from McGill. He was practicing in London, Ontario, where he became involved with a young woman named Flora Eliza Brooks. She became pregnant. Her father compelled Cream to marry her in September 1876. Flora Cream died shortly after the marriage in circumstances that were considered suspicious by those who knew the parties involved. Cream was not prosecuted in connection with her death. The matter was noted and set aside. He departed for further study in Britain and Edinburgh, and the death of Flora Cream passed without formal legal consequence. What followed in the United States was not set aside. Cream established a medical practice in Chicago, Illinois, in the early 1880s. He became involved with a woman named Julia Stott, the wife of a patient under his care, a man named Daniel Stott, who suffered from epilepsy and for whom Cream was supplying medicine. The relationship between Cream and Julia Stott became intimate. In June 1881, Daniel Stott died. The cause of death was attributed initially to his underlying condition. Cream then wrote a letter to the coroner of the county in which Stott had died, alleging that the pharmacist who had prepared Stott's medicine had made an error in its composition and that the error had caused the death. The letter drew the attention of the authorities to a death that had not been the subject of any suspicion. Stott's body was exhumed. Strychnine was found. The investigation that followed led directly to Thomas Neal Cream. He was arrested in Illinois, tried for the murder of Daniel Stott, and convicted. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and was received at Joliet State Penitentiary in Illinois in November 1881. He remained at Joliet for approximately 10 years. The commutation of his sentence, effected in the period leading to his release in July 1891, involved a lobbying effort on his behalf connected to an inheritance he received following his father's death. The precise mechanism of the commutation, whether it was a gubernatorial act or a parole board determination, requires verification against the Illinois prison records. The effect was not in dispute. Thomas Neal Cream walked out of Joliet State Penitentiary in July 1891 after serving a fraction of a life sentence for strychnine poisoning. He had drawn the attention of the coroner to himself. He had arrived in England by October of 1891. He took lodgings in the Lambeth Palace Road area, presenting himself as a respectable physician of North American origin, and he began to move through the streets and public houses of Lambeth. The method he employed was consistent across the cases attributed to him. He approached women, predominantly women who supported themselves through prostitution, in public places or in the vicinity of their lodgings. He offered them pills, presenting the pills variously as medicine, as a tonic, or as some other beneficial preparation. The pills contained strychnine. The amount contained in each dose was sufficient to kill. He watched the women take the pills, or gave them the pills, and departed. The interval between ingestion and the onset of symptoms was, as noted, 15 to 30 minutes. Cream did not remain to witness the consequences. He moved through the district and was not immediately connected to the deaths that followed. His first known victim in London was Ellen Donworth, who died on the 13th of October 1891 in the Waterloo area of South London, a week before Matilda Clover. Donworth's death was investigated, but the connection between that death and others was not established in the immediate aftermath. Cream visited Matilda Clover at her lodgings on the 20th of October. He gave her strychnine-laced pills. He departed. She died. The attending physician recorded delirium tremens. The inquest closed. The murder of Matilda Clover was not, at that time, the murder of Matilda Clover in the official record. It was a natural death, and Thomas Neal Cream continued in the district. The investigation that would eventually account for Clover's death did not begin with her. It began in a manner consistent with the rest of Cream's behaviour, with Cream himself. In the weeks and months following the deaths of his victims in the autumn and early winter of 1891, Cream began writing letters. The letters were addressed to various parties and served different immediate purposes, but they shared a common characteristic. They extended Cream's involvement in events that he could have left entirely undetected. He was not blackmailed into writing them. He was not responding to police inquiries that had come close to him. He was writing of his own volition, drawing attention to murders that the official record had not yet identified as murders, and implicating himself in the process. One of those letters was addressed to Dr. William Broadbent, a prominent London physician of considerable professional standing. The letter accused Broadbent of having poisoned Matilda Clover and demanded a substantial sum of money to prevent exposure. Cream signed the letter under a false name. The letter was explicit. It named Matilda Clover as a woman who had been murdered by poison and named Broadbent as the party responsible for that poisoning. Dr. Broadbent took the letter to Scotland Yard. The letter placed Scotland Yard in an unusual position. It named a murder victim, Matilda Clover, at a time when the official record of Lambeth contained no such victim. The coroner's record showed a natural death from delirium tremens. The inquest had closed with that verdict. If the letter was to be believed in any part, either the allegation against Broadbent, which Scotland Yard had no reason to credit, or the allegation that a woman named Matilda Clover had been poisoned, then one of two things had to follow. Either the letter writer possessed information about a death that had been misdiagnosed, or the letter was a fabrication from beginning to end. Only a person with direct knowledge of the death could have known to name Matilda Clover as a murder victim when the official record did not contain a murder. Scotland Yard noted the letter and proceeded with its investigations. The Broadbent letter was not immediately acted upon in terms of an exhumation, but it was not disregarded, it was retained. Its significance would become apparent in the months that followed. In the spring of 1892, the investigation was accelerated by events that admitted no ambiguity. On the night of the 11th and 12th of April 1892, two young women died at lodgings in Stamford Street, Lambeth. Their names were Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel. The symptoms of their deaths were unmistakable. The convulsive pattern of strychnine poisoning, violent and characteristic, observed by witnesses in a manner that left no clinical room for misattribution. The deaths of Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel open an active police investigation into strychnine poisoning in the Lambeth area. The pattern of similar deaths in the same district became visible to the investigators at Scotland Yard. The investigation was led by Inspector John Bennett Tunbridge of the Criminal Investigation Department at Scotland Yard. Tunbridge and his officers began the process of consolidating what was known about the deaths of women in Lambeth in the preceding months, and of developing lines of inquiry that might connect those deaths to a common source. The death of Ellen Donworth in October 1891 was reviewed. The Broadbent letter, already on file at Scotland Yard, was returned to as a document requiring fresh attention in the light of what the Marsh and Shrivel deaths had established. The name of Matilda Clover, which had appeared in that letter as the alleged victim of a poison murder when the official record showed a natural death, was now considered against the background of confirmed strychnine poisoning in the same district. The order was given for the exhumation of Matilda Clover's remains. The exhumation was carried out on the orders of the Home Office. Clover's body, buried in the month since her death in October 1891, was disinterred and examined by Dr. Thomas Stevenson, the senior analyst to the Home Office. Stevenson was the foremost forensic toxicologist in England at that time, the expert called upon in the major poison cases brought before the courts, and a figure of recognised authority in the emerging discipline of forensic chemistry as it was applied to criminal investigation. His examination of Clover's exhumed remains was conducted with the methods available to Victorian toxicology at its highest level of practice. Stevenson found strychnine in the remains of Matilda Clover. The original cause of death certified by the attending physician, delirium tremens, was overturned. Matilda Clover had not died from the effects of alcoholism. She had been poisoned. She had been murdered in October 1891. The murder had been certified as a natural death, reviewed by a coroner's jury, and filed as a closed matter. It had remained a closed matter for the better part of a year. The scientific examination of her exhumed remains, ordered only because her name had appeared in a blackmail letter written by her killer, established for the first time the fact that a crime had been committed. A second inquest was convened. The fresh proceedings were held in the light of Stevenson's toxicological findings. The evidence before the jury at the second inquest was materially different from the evidence that had been available at the first. It now included expert testimony identifying strychnine as the cause of death and the context of an active police investigation into strychnine poisoning in the Lambeth area. The jury at the second inquest returned a verdict of willful murder. The file that had been closed as a natural death was reopened as a homicide. The committal proceedings that followed sent the matter to the Central Criminal Court. The investigation, meanwhile, had developed additional lines of evidence. Officers working under Inspector Tunbridge canvassed the area, took statements, and developed witness accounts connecting a man of respectable appearance visiting women in Lambeth lodging houses to the deaths under investigation. 2 witnesses in particular provided evidence of significance to the eventual prosecution. The first was a woman named Lou Harvey. Harvey had encountered Cream on a prior occasion, some weeks before the deaths that had triggered the formal investigation. Cream had given her pills in circumstances similar to those he employed with his other victims. Harvey, for reasons that the record does not fully establish, did not swallow the pills he gave her, and she survived the encounter. When the investigation became known, and descriptions of the suspect circulated through the networks of those who lived and worked in the Lambeth area, Harvey came forward. She was able to identify Cream and to give evidence about the circumstances in which he had provided pills to her. Her survival and her willingness to come forward gave the prosecution a witness who could testify from direct personal experience to the method Cream employed. The second significant witness was a man named John Haynes, an American who had made Cream's acquaintance in London during the period under investigation. Cream had, in the pattern of self-disclosure that characterised his behaviour throughout, spoken to Haynes about the murders. He had shown Haynes newspaper cuttings about the Lambeth poisonings. He had made statements that, when considered against the evidence of the deaths, indicated a knowledge of the cases that could not reasonably be explained on the basis of general press awareness. Haynes came forward to the investigating officers and provided a statement. His account of what Cream had said to him was entered into the body of evidence against the accused. Cream was arrested by Inspector Tunbridge in June 1892. The arrest of Thomas Neal Cream in June 1892 concluded the investigative phase and transferred the matter to the formal processes of the criminal courts. Cream was taken into custody by Inspector Tunbridge and conveyed to the relevant police station, where he was charged. He denied the allegations against him. The committal proceedings that followed considered the evidence accumulated by Scotland Yard and determined that the case was sufficient to proceed to trial at the Central Criminal Court. Cream was remanded to await trial. The committal proceeded without significant incident. The case was prepared for the Old Bailey. The period between Cream's arrest in June and the commencement of his trial in October 1892 was occupied by the preparation of the prosecution's case, the organisation of witness statements, and the formal legal processes required to bring a capital charge to trial at the Central Criminal Court. The evidence against Cream was of several distinct types, each requiring separate preparation. The toxicological evidence required Stevenson's formal report and his readiness to testify as an expert witness. The identification evidence required the statements of Lou Harvey and others who had encountered Cream directly. The correspondence evidence required the physical letters, including the Broadbent letter, to be produced and authenticated. The witness testimony of John Haynes required a full statement detailing the conversations in which Cream had disclosed knowledge of the murders. Inspector Tunbridge and his officers assembled this material over the months between the arrest and the trial. The trial of Thomas Neal Cream commenced at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, on the 17th of October 1892. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Henry Hawkins, one of the most prominent criminal judges of the late Victorian period, known for the rigour of his conduct of capital proceedings and for the severity of his sentencing. Hawkins had presided over significant criminal trials for many years and brought to the Cream proceedings the methodical authority of long judicial experience. The courtroom at the Old Bailey was occupied by press representatives, legal observers, and the public gallery, which drew attendance throughout the proceedings. The case had attracted considerable press attention during the months between Cream's arrest and the commencement of trial, and the courtroom reflected that level of public interest. The prosecution was led by Sir Charles Russell, the Attorney General, a barrister of the highest professional standing, who would later serve as Lord Chief Justice under the title Lord Russell of Killowen. Russell's presence at the head of the prosecution team reflected the gravity with which the case was regarded by the authorities. The defence was conducted by Gerald Geoghegan. Cream entered a plea of not guilty to the charge of the murder of Matilda Clover. The prosecution opened its case before Mr. Justice Hawkins and presented the evidence in the order of its development. The opening statement set out the sequence of events as the prosecution intended to establish it. The visit to Clover's lodgings on the night of the 20th of October, 1891, the administration of strychnine-laced pills, Clover's death in convulsions that same night, the misdiagnosis of delirium tremens, the subsequent blackmail letter naming Clover as a murder victim, the exhumation, and Stevenson's toxicological findings. The prosecution framed its case as one in which the defendant had not only murdered Matilda Clover, but had, through his own letters, provided the means by which the murder was identified and his responsibility established. Dr. Thomas Stevenson was called as the principal expert witness for the prosecution. His testimony addressed the findings of the post-exhumation examination of Matilda Clover's remains. He described the methods by which strychnine could be identified in decomposed organic material and set out the specific findings of his analysis. He stated that strychnine was present in Clover's exhumed remains in a quantity consistent with fatal poisoning. He explained the mechanism of strychnine's action and its effects upon the human body, providing the jury with the clinical basis for understanding what Clover had endured in the hours before her death. Stevenson was a practiced expert witness, familiar with the procedures of the Old Bailey and with the requirements of the court in presenting technical evidence to a lay jury. His testimony was not effectively challenged by the defence. The toxicological findings he presented were the factual foundation of the case. Lou Harvey was called to give evidence of her own encounter with Cream. She described the circumstances in which she had met him, the occasion on which he had provided pills to her, and the fact that she had not swallowed them. She had survived. She was able to identify Cream in the dock as the man who had given her the pills. Her testimony was significant because it demonstrated a pattern of conduct beyond the specific facts of the Clover case, and because she represented the mechanism by which Cream selected and approached his victims. The defence cross-examined Harvey on the details of her account. Her evidence as to the identification of Cream was not fundamentally displaced by that cross-examination. She remained a credible witness for the jury. John Haynes gave evidence of the conversations he had conducted with Cream during the period of the murders. He described Cream's references to the Lambeth poisonings, the newspaper cuttings Cream had shown him, and the statements Cream had made that indicated a knowledge of the cases beyond what was available to a member of the public reading the press coverage. Haynes's testimony was that of an acquaintance who had received disclosures he had not sought and who had brought them to the attention of the investigating officers. The defence challenged the reliability of Haynes's account, but his evidence formed part of a cumulative case against Cream that incorporated multiple independent strands. The Broadbent letter was produced in evidence. Its significance was explained by the prosecution. It had named Matilda Clover as a murder victim at a time when the official record showed her death as a natural one, and only a person with direct knowledge of the killing could have written it in that form. The other letters Cream had written in connection with the Lambeth cases were also produced. The pattern of Cream's correspondence, accusing innocent men of crimes he had committed, demanding money under threat of exposure, and naming victims whose deaths had not been identified as crimes, was placed before the jury as evidence of conduct consistent only with the guilt of the writer. Evidence was also given placing Cream in the vicinity of victims' addresses at relevant times and establishing his presence in Lambeth during the periods in question. Strychnine in capsule form had been found in Cream's lodgings during the search conducted after his arrest. The physical possession of strychnine was introduced as consistent with the means of the murders. The murders of Ellen Donworth, Alice Marsh, and Emma Shrivel were introduced as similar fact evidence. The court admitted evidence of these uncharged murders on the basis that they established a pattern of behaviour so consistent in its method, location, and victim selection that the similar fact principle warranted their admission to demonstrate that the death of Matilda Clover was not an isolated event but part of a series of acts by the same person. The admission of this evidence was a significant legal step. It placed before the jury not merely the facts of Clover's death, but the cumulative weight of 3 additional deaths, sharing the same method, the same district, and the same period, all of which were connected to Cream by witness identification or physical evidence. The defence conducted by Gerald Jegigan challenged the case on its identifiable weaknesses. The identification evidence was tested. Witnesses who placed Cream at specific locations were cross-examined as to the conditions of observation and the reliability of their identification. Stevenson's toxicological findings were challenged on methodological grounds, though the challenge did not produce a competing expert account of sufficient credibility to displace his conclusions. The defence advanced the argument that the evidence was insufficient to establish Cream's guilt beyond reasonable doubt, and that the identification evidence, in particular, was subject to the errors characteristic of such testimony. The defence case did not call Cream to give evidence on his own behalf. The prosecution addressed the jury in closing and returned to the central fact that dominated the case. Cream had named Matilda Clover as a murder victim in the Broadbent letter at a time when she was not recorded as a murder victim by any official institution. No innocent man could have written that letter. No person who was not the killer could have known what that letter contained. The letter, combined with Stevenson's forensic confirmation of strychnine in Clover's remains, and the pattern of conduct established by the other evidence, produced a case that the prosecution submitted was overwhelming. Mr. Justice Hawkins directed the jury in terms that reviewed the evidence methodically and explained the legal tests they were required to apply. He addressed the similar fact evidence, the expert testimony, and the identification evidence in sequence. The direction occupied a substantial period. The jury retired to consider its verdict. The deliberation was not prolonged. The jury returned to the courtroom and delivered a verdict of guilty on the charge of the murder of Matilda Clover. The verdict was entered in the record of the Central Criminal Court. The prosecution's case, built across the summer months from the evidence gathered by Inspector Tunbridge and his officers, the toxicological findings of Dr. Stevenson, and the letters that Cream had written himself, had been accepted by the jury. The conviction would determine what followed. The court proceeded to sentencing on the same day as the verdict. Mr. Justice Hawkins addressed the convicted man. The specific words of the sentencing remarks were reported at length in the press coverage of the trial, though the standard secondary accounts do not reproduce them verbatim. The judge's remarks reflected the gravity of the case and the character of the evidence. He sentenced Thomas Neal Cream to death. Cream was removed from the dock and conveyed to the condemned cells. The machinery of the criminal law, having convicted him of the murder of Matilda Clover on the evidence of a crime he had rendered detectable only by naming it himself, now moved toward its conclusion. No appeal was lodged that succeeded in delaying the execution. No reprieve was sought that was granted. The sentence was confirmed. The date of execution was set for the 15th of November, 1892, 4 weeks after the verdict. The period between sentencing and execution was occupied in the ordinary way of condemned prisoners in the late Victorian period. Cream was held at Newgate Prison, which by 1892 was already a building that the authorities had marked for eventual demolition. The prison had long since ceased to conduct public executions outside its walls, a practice that had ended in 1868 following the passage of the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of that year. Executions from 1868 onward were conducted within the prison precincts, before a small attendance of officials required by law to be present: the sheriff or under-sheriff of the City of London, the prison governor, the chaplain, the medical officer, and press representatives permitted under the regulations of the period. The execution was not a public event. It was an administrative act conducted inside the walls. On the morning of the 15th of November 1892, the execution of Thomas Neal Cream was carried out at Newgate Prison in accordance with the sentence of the Central Criminal Court. The day was a Monday. The execution was scheduled for 8 o'clock in the morning, the standard hour for judicial hangings conducted within the prison under the regulations that had governed the procedure since the cessation of public executions in 1868. The officials required by law to be present assembled within the prison precincts before the appointed hour. The Under-Sheriff of the City of London attended in his official capacity. The Governor of Newgate Prison was present. The prison chaplain performed the customary religious offices for the condemned man in the period immediately before the execution. The medical officer of the prison was in attendance to certify death following the drop. Press representatives admitted under the regulations governing prison executions were present to record the event for publication. The number of persons in attendance was small by the standards of the public executions that had preceded the 1868 legislation, when crowds of many thousands had gathered outside Newgate to witness the deaths of condemned criminals. The execution of Cream was witnessed by fewer than a dozen persons. The executioner was James Billington, who served as the principal hangman of the period and carried out a significant number of judicial executions in England during the 1890s. Billington conducted the procedure in the established manner. The condemned man was brought from the condemned cell, his arms pinioned behind him, and led to the scaffold within the prison. The chaplain attended him as far as the scaffold. The procedures established for the conduct of an execution under the 1868 system were followed. The drop was calculated according to the standard tables used by executioners of the period, which set the length of the drop in relation to the weight of the condemned man, with the purpose of producing rapid unconsciousness and death through fracture or dislocation of the cervical vertebrae, while avoiding the decapitation that resulted from an excessively long drop. Thomas Neal Cream died on the scaffold at Newgate Prison on the 15th of November 1892. The medical officer certified death. The proceedings were recorded by the attending press representatives, whose accounts appeared in the following day's newspapers. The Times carried a brief report on the execution, consistent with its coverage throughout the trial. Other London newspapers reported the matter in terms appropriate to their respective readerships. Cream was buried within the precincts of Newgate Prison, as was the standard practice for executed criminals. When Newgate Prison was demolished in 1902 to make way for the new Central Criminal Court building that occupies the site today, the remains of those buried within the prison precincts were removed and reinterred elsewhere. The execution concluded the legal proceedings arising from the murder of Matilda Clover. The case in its formal dimensions was closed. The verdict had been entered. The sentence had been carried out. The record was complete in its official terms. What the official record contained, and what it did not contain, was a matter that the case had illustrated with particular clarity throughout its development. The official record of October 1891 had contained a natural death from delirium tremens. It had not contained the murder of Matilda Clover, because no institution had looked for one. The official record of 1892 contained the trial, conviction, and execution of the man who had committed that murder, established on the basis of evidence that included his own letters naming Clover as a victim. The record had been corrected. The correction had required an exhumation, a forensic examination, by the most senior toxicologist in the country, a second inquest, and a capital trial at the Old Bailey. The correction had been possible at all only because the murderer had written to an innocent man accusing him of his own crime. The case of Thomas Neal Cream entered the historical and legal literature in the decades that followed, principally as a case about the perpetrator rather than about the victim. The first substantial dedicated treatment appeared in 1973 when John Cashman published an account of the case under the title The Gentleman from Chicago, drawing on the available contemporary sources to reconstruct the events of Cream's career on both sides of the Atlantic. Angus MacLaren's scholarly study, A Prescription for Murder, The Victorian Serial Killer, published in 1993 by the University of Chicago Press, placed the case within the broader context of Victorian forensic and social history, with a scholarly apparatus that drew on primary sources and provided the academic foundation for subsequent treatments. The most thoroughly researched account in the modern period is Dean Jobs' The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream, published in 2021, which drew on archival material, including the Old Bailey transcript, the contemporary press, and records from both England and Illinois to produce the most detailed, single-volume reconstruction of the case available. These works and the various documentary treatments that appeared in British true crime programming across the late 20th and early 21st centuries constitute the cultural afterlife of the case. Cream has appeared in numerous survey treatments of Victorian serial killers and in the context of the history of forensic toxicology. The legal significance of the case, particularly the admission of similar fact evidence in the form of the other uncharged murders, has been noted in legal histories of the Old Bailey and in studies of the development of the similar fact principle in English criminal law. Matilda Clover does not appear independently in this cultural record. She is named in each of these treatments as a victim. She does not have a cultural presence separate from the case that bears her killer's name. The cultural afterlife of the Cream case is the cultural afterlife of Thomas Neal Cream. Clover is a name in that record, confirmed as a murder victim by exhumation and by the evidence of a letter written to accuse another man of her death. The historical significance of the case operates on several distinct levels, each of which the record supports independently. The forensic significance is the most clearly documented. The case of Matilda Clover is one of the cases in which Victorian forensic toxicology demonstrated its capacity to recover evidence from exhumed remains months after death, under conditions that would not have seemed to offer much prospect of successful analysis. Dr. Thomas Stevenson's findings in the exhumation were the product of analytical methods that had been developed over the preceding decades, in part through the work of earlier Home Office analysts, and in part through the growing body of forensic chemistry literature. The Cream trial stands in the sequence of Victorian poison trials, alongside the Madeline Smith case of 1857, the Florence Maybrick case of 1889, and others, as a case in which the capacity of forensic science to produce evidence in the criminal courts was tested and confirmed. Stevenson's role as the institutional expert called upon by the Home Office to examine remains in circumstances where foul play was suspected reflects the development of a professional infrastructure for forensic investigation in England by the 1890s. The infrastructure existed. In the Clover case, however, it was brought to bear only because a blackmail letter had named a victim. It had not been brought to bear in October 1891 when Clover died because the institutions of the period had determined that no investigation was required. The regulatory significance is also documented. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 required records to be kept in the dispensing of scheduled poisons, and strychnine was a scheduled substance. A medical practitioner operating with professional credentials had access to strychnine through channels that the regulatory system did not close to him. Cream's qualifications, obtained at McGill and in London, gave him a plausible cover for the acquisition of strychnine consistent with legitimate medical use. The regulatory framework that existed in 1891 was not designed to detect a physician who intended to poison. It was designed to restrict access by those without professional standing. The distinction proved in this case to be material. The social significance of the case is reflected most clearly in the fate of the original inquest verdict. A young woman died in violent circumstances in a Lambeth lodging house on the 20th of October 1891. A physician attended her and made a clinical determination without ordering further investigation. A coroner's jury accepted that determination on the evidence presented to it. The case was closed. The entirety of that sequence was the ordinary operation of the Victorian institutional framework as applied to a death in that social stratum. There was nothing exceptional about the application of reduced scrutiny to the death of Matilda Clover. The same reduced scrutiny was applied routinely to deaths in similar circumstances throughout the Lambeth district and comparable districts of London. What was exceptional was that, in this case, the murderer subsequently provided the evidence that established the fact of the murder. The Broadbent letter occupies a specific position in the history of criminal investigation because of the logical problem it presented to Scotland Yard on receipt. A letter naming a person as a murder victim when no murder had been recorded could only have been written by the murderer or by a person with direct knowledge of a murder that the official record did not contain. The letter was not actionable as a blackmail demand in the ordinary sense, because the accusation it contained against Broadbent was manifestly false, and Broadbent was in no position of vulnerability. But it was actionable as a piece of evidence about a crime that might otherwise never have been identified. It was, in the precise sense, a confession written as an accusation. Cream accused Broadbent of his own act. The letter reached Scotland Yard. When the deaths of Marsh and Shrivell in April 1892 produced the confirmed strychnine evidence that opened the active investigation, the Broadbent letter, already on file, gave Tunbridge and his officers a direction to pursue. The exhumation of Clover followed. The investigation converged. The arrest was made. The record does not preserve what would have happened to the death of Matilda Clover if Cream had remained silent. The delirium tremens verdict would have stood. No subsequent investigation would have disturbed it, because no subsequent investigation into the death of a young sex worker in Lambeth, recorded as a natural death and closed by a coroner's jury in October 1891, would have been initiated in the ordinary run of events. The record would have remained as it was. Clover's murder would have been indistinguishable in the official documentation from the thousands of other deaths of young women in London's poorest districts in that period. The record would have closed. The question would not, in that eventuality, have remained open in any formal sense. There would have been no question to remain open. The name of the attending physician who certified her death as delirium tremens does not appear with certainty in the accessible secondary record. The name of the coroner who presided at the original inquest does not appear with certainty in the accessible secondary record. The name of the landlady who was roused by Clover's distress on the night of the 20th of October and who subsequently gave evidence is not confirmed in the standard accounts. The location of Matilda Clover's burial remains unrecorded in the literature. Her birth date, her birthplace, the names of her parents, and the circumstances of her life before she appears in a Lambeth lodging house in 1891 are not documented in any source available to the standard scholarly literature. The record begins with her death. It does not begin with her life. She was approximately 27 years old. The case of Matilda Clover was the sole case examined in this record, and it closes as the record itself closes. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1892. The case became part of the national record. It has not left.